Good afternoon and welcome to this, the final event in Conservative Home's Spring Conference Fringe programme today. We're very fortunate to be joined for this event by Sajid Javid. We've partnered as Conservative Home with the Coalition for Global Prosperity for this event, who do vital work, and really that implies all you need to know about the conversation that's about to come. Britain's changing place in the world, the way the world is changing around us, and the future for development and the part this country can play in it. And for all of you at home, I know there's people watching through the party conference side, people watching on YouTube, people watching on Zoom. Thank you for tuning in. If you would like to put your questions forward for Ryan, the CEO of the coalition, to put across in this conversation, press that Q&A button. The questions will ping through to me and we'll put them across to him. So I know that everybody's tuned in to hear the main event, not to hear from me. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ryan for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you so much, Sajid, for being with us this afternoon. Look, there's absolutely tons that I want to get through. And as Mark says, there'll be lots of questions from the audience, I'm sure. Before we get on talking about foreign policy, I'm absolutely fascinated, Sajid, in your journey into politics. And I really mean that because I think, like me, you went to your local comprehensive. At my school, it was so ropey. If you got a job at the end of it, you'd already exceeded expectations. It didn't really matter what it was. But before you went into politics, you were a managing director of Deutsche Bank. How did you do it?
Wow, where do you want me to start? But first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to join you. And let me just say right at the start, I'm an admirer of the work that the coalition does and the values we represent. So I'm very pleased especially pleased to join you today. Look, I've talked often about my journey. It's a journey shared, I think, in some ways by many people, but not enough people. Let's say that in our great country. It's made me a big believer in social justice and how we can really improve things. It's one of the things that motivated me to get into politics in the first place. How it worked for me, there were lots of reasons. If I had to pick just a couple, if I may, I'd say number one, I was really blessed with fantastic parents, and not everyone can have that, of course. But that made a difference, having that stable sort of family background, that environment. And number two, I'd probably pick education. For me, especially my family, we really valued education in school, and whatever school it was, good or bad, you made the most of it, and with the teachers and your friends and things. And I think education really helped me a lot. I was the first in my family to get to university. That helped to open doors as well. But if I could just pick two things, I'd probably just stick to those.
And talking of university, I know that when you were, it was at Exeter, I believe.
That's right.
You went.
Yeah.
And I know one of my former boss and now great friend is David Burrows. And
Yes.
I know you were part of this extraordinary squad or quad before AOC stole it in the States. Tim Montgomery, Rob Halfon, David Burrows, and yourself.
We're all good mates.
Yeah, what was that like? What was that experience like being at Exeter and being
Well,
surrounded
actually, the four of us, we actually met very early on. It was, I think, in Freshers Week. And it won't surprise probably people watching that it was at the stand for what was called the Exeter University Conservative Association. So we all sort of met there to join that club, and then went for a drink afterwards, and that's how the friendship began. But obviously, we all had an interest in conservative politics. We all just arrived fresh-faced at university, and the friendship began straight away, and all of us have remained friends ever since.
And David used to tell me stories about taking on the student unions and things like that.
All the time, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? When I was at uni about 10 years ago, you could, I was outnumbered by communists 100 to 1, like every other young conservative, I think, at these things. But you could engage, you could debate. What do you think's happened on some of our campuses now, where we get to a situation where people are being no platformed simply because the particular group of students doesn't want them there? Do you think this is a passing fad, or do you think something's gone wrong with how we address freedom of speech, particularly on university campuses?
I wish I could say it was a fad and it will just go away, but I do think, unfortunately, it's a bit more deeper than that. And what's caused it, I think, many issues. And it's not just, if we're honest, it's not just on university campuses, but more broadly in society. There seems to be globally a bit more division, around a lot more division in some cases. And this whole sort of cancel culture thing that people just can't say what they really think. And that, as you said, right, I think it's got worse over time, and there should be no place for that. We all benefit from open debate, as long as we're all just respectful to each other. It's perfectly right, of course, to have differences of opinion. It's what strengthens us. And if I have a particular opinion, I want someone to test it. I might not agree with them, but it might make me more confident and stronger. So it benefits everyone. And in universities, of course, you're actually there mainly for learning. I remember when I was business secretary, and at that time that department included higher education as part of its portfolio, and I started sort of trying to confront this issue sort of head on for the first time, and I just came across too many bad examples. I remember some in particular that I think they were basically platforms that were anti-Semitic, and they were turning against Jewish students. It was unacceptable then. We took action then, but we just need to keep calling this out and doing something about it wherever we can, both at home and abroad as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thinking about your early experience with David and Robert and Tim and others, was there any particular thinker or philosopher or conservative who really stood out to you as someone who helped shape your views? I know in your leadership speech you mentioned Disraeli and being an outsider. Was there anyone who you sort of looked to as a lodestar and who you sort of took with you in your career subsequently in politics?
Well, Disraeli, I mentioned, as you say that, because of that sort of a bit of an outsider feeling. And sometimes I have sort of felt like that as well, not in a bad way, but just in that, I was born and bred in the UK, but, I have roots in other cultures and countries as well. And it perhaps sometimes it gives me a different perspective on things. And sometimes it can take a bit of an outsider to really admire what we've got here in the UK. And it's made me, I guess, even more proud of our great country. But in terms of other individuals, I mean, I have to say, for the time I was you're becoming more politically active, that time in university, it was Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she dominated the political scene, and she changed our country, and indeed, changed parts of the world, for the better. And that doesn't mean to say you have to agree with every single thing every government always does, but she had a great influence on me. And in fact, it reminded how politicians, what they do can really change lives. You mentioned earlier a moment ago that I worked in the city, and at that time people like me didn't really get jobs in the city, and I thought about why that happened for me. And one of the reasons I would say is because Margaret Thatcher had this thing called the Big Bang. She deregulated the city. It became a lot more competitive. She ended all the cozy closed shops, and as a result, businesses became more focused on talent rather than connections, and that helped people like me. And I think it was a big driver of social justice, and it's just one of the reasons I've admired her.
Sure, it's really interesting. I completely share that. I mean, you mentioned in your leadership speech again about the old school tie network, and I think you've alluded to it there in the city. I mean, I remember I sort of first day in an office, my tie was turquoise because no one in the family wore a suit. So, you just don't know. But as you say, fortunately, we were past that age where, that would really hold you back. But what do you think needs to happen to get even better at social mobility in this country? So for all the people like yourself and perhaps myself who have managed to overcome those obstacles, there will be plenty, as you know, who don't. Do you think, A, there's still a long way to go, and B, what do you think needs to change?
Well, I'd say a really good thing in our country is we have an abundance of talent. All across the country, every corner of the UK, you can find talented people, young, old, every background. The challenge, I think, really is about opportunity. And how do we spread more opportunity right across the country? And obviously, there's a lot to that, but at its heart has to be what I always call like a free enterprise economy, where you keep your taxes low and sensible regulations and promote competition, allow creators to create and support innovation. And that's by and large what we've had as a country for many years, but we can't take it for granted. And this government is doing lots of good work to try and progress that, especially in more left behind areas. But having a prosperous economy is absolutely key. And the government always working towards that, because that's what helps create the opportunity that we all need. So I'd put that sort of top of the list. Secondly, and it comes back to a point I just made a moment ago, I think it's education and skills, making sure that people, particularly young people, have the skills that a modern economy is going to need. There's a technological revolution going on. It's at an unprecedented pace. It's going to, if anything, this pandemic has accelerated that, but it's going to continue. So we've got to make sure young people have those skills, and also those people that sadly find themselves out of a job. Maybe their industry has been hard hit, international travel at the moment, for example. We've got to be able to help those people reskill, but very quickly, and incentivize them to do so. There's many other things I can think of, but that's what comes straight to my head about how we can try and promote social justice and create more opportunity for everyone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's an interesting point. I mean, one of the things I find interesting is when I speak to politicians who have to reflect and think about what they want to achieve in office, and then they go into office, and those deeply held convictions and assumptions collide, if you like, with the reality of day-to-day government. And I'm thinking particularly your early experience of government was during the austerity years, when the party was dealing with the public finances. And of course, towards the end of your period in government, a completely different context. The pandemic meant that we had to rightly invest and make sure that we were doing what we could to see off the worst impacts. How do you square the beliefs and assumptions that the Thatchers and the Israelis that you sort of went into politics with the day-to-day reality of governing?
Well, you have to deal with the world as you find it, not as you want it. And so, for instance, when we first came back to office, as Conservatives with that coalition government to begin with back in 2010, we inherited a huge economic mess. And that meant at the time the right way forward was to first of all bring the public finances under control. It wouldn't have been sustainable any other way. We would have all lost out had the government not taken that action. But it did mean then you've got to make these tough decisions around public services, where you're going to find those savings and those efficiencies, the impact that's going to have on people. And it's not, of course, it's not easy. But I guess if your question is how can you do that, and knowing that sometimes you have to make decisions that is taking something away from someone, and in my mind always would be it's for the greater, you're doing it for the greater good. So for example, in those sort of austerity years, had we not taken the action that we did and made those difficult decisions, I absolutely always believed that the impact of not making decisions would have meant a potential debt crisis, an interest rate crisis, and even bigger cuts and costs later on, which would have had an even bigger impact on people and their day-to-day lives. And I think if you can sort of think strategically, try to think more longer term, rather than just the sort of a more sort of, let's say, populist short-term decision, I think that's the right way to go and for politicians to think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's interesting thinking about the just the day-to-day mechanics of it all. What's it like, the relentless grind of government? Because you held two of the great offices of state, 3 other cabinet positions, an enormous, a sort of lifetime's worth of government positions. What's it like on a very human level, dealing with the day-to-day relentless decision-making that's required, particularly in a 24-hour news age, in a decade which has seen a referendum, 4 general elections, and of course now a pandemic?
Yeah, look, first of all, I'd say my colleagues in government, I don't envy the workload they have, what they have to deal with. Even in normal times, it's tough and heavy going, of course. But look at what we've just gone through as a country in the last year, obviously the pandemic, the health impact of that itself, but also the economic cost of that. And it's true, yes, it's happening the world over, but it's also, as we're thinking, of course, about our own country, and the pressure, I think, has been relentless on my colleagues. And one of the things I've always found in every department is that it sort of makes sense to, if you're the Secretary of State, to think about the sort of 2 or 3 things, probably no more, that you really want to make a difference in your time as the sort of head of that department. Because try to do more than that, you'll probably just do a little bit of everything and not really get enough strategic direction and change. And then also to try and just leave time for those things that are going to happen, those fires you're going to have to put out, just because that's just the nature of the job. If it happens on your watch, you're going to have to deal with it, and it can take up a huge amount of your time and effort. But just always sort of plan for that to the extent that you can, that a lot of your time is going to be needed for things that you could not possibly have foreseen.
We're going to turn in a second to global Britain, but before I do, I have a question here from Christian Lund. He asks, how should the government lower the deficit after the pandemic is over? Tax rises, cuts in expenditure, or a mixture of the two?
Well, I think first of all, I'd say that the Rishi's response, the Chancellor's response, has been the right ones from the start of this pandemic, which is to, as he said himself, to do whatever it takes. And that meant, of course, borrowing a lot more, and that's been right. I think that's perfectly justifiable. But it's borrowing, that increased borrowing for the short term is temporary, as in it was emergency spending. Of course, that needs to, first and foremost, that needs to be put back under control. So when the emergency is over, the emergency spending needs to stop. Longer term, we of course are going to need to spend more in 2 or 3 areas, I think, for sure, because of the impact of the pandemic. Healthcare, for instance, social care, and education, just 3 areas that I think are certainly going to need more longer term investment. We've got to find the best way to pay for that. And this won't be an easy set of decisions, but ultimately the way that we are going to pay for that is going to be growth, because that's the only sustainable way to do this, which comes back to something I said a moment ago, is that if we want to not only have opportunity and prosperity, but actually pay for the public services we all rely on, it comes back to the economy. And we've always got to be pro-business, pro-economy, pro-growth, because that's what's going to pay for all these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll turn now to global Britain. This wonderful catch-all banner that we latch onto and we use to as a hook for all our sort of thoughts around future foreign policy for the UK. We have got 2 really big events coming up this year: G7 in June, COP26 in November. What does success look like, do you think, for the UK and for the government from those 2 events?
Well, first of all, I'd say global Britain. That's, for me, that's it's an open, outward-looking, confident Britain. I think that's where we are. And some people say, look, you guys have left the EU. Hasn't that sort of diminished you in some way? I'd say absolutely not. I mean, first of all, yes, we've left the EU, but we're still very much engaged in the world. G7, G20, NATO, part of the permanent 5 in the UN Security Council. And our hard power, our military is amongst the very, very best in the world. Our soft power, something that a lot about from your work, whether that's through international aid, but also our culture, our language. So we are a really true global force. And also what that means for me is that global Britain now outside the EU is a country that, in a way, that as we engage with the globe's problems, which we certainly are going to do, I think the integrated review made that absolutely clear just in this last week, that I think we're now in a position where perhaps we can act more of a sort of a broker with the international problems, the challenges that are faced, because we're not obviously part of the EU anymore. We're our own independent sovereign nation, but we have both the experience, the scale, and the ability to help shape the world. We can either shape the world or we can be shaped by it. And what I see is a global Britain that's going to stand up for these global challenges and confront them. You mentioned the G7 and the COP. That I think is a perfect example of both what we're doing and certainly looking ahead now. So for the rest of this year, what we can achieve. If you look at the priorities already, I think the government's been clear about helping with the pandemic, being fully engaged with that. That could mean vaccines, for example, both for the developed world, with our friends in the EU, but also certainly the developing world. We've taken a real leadership, for example, in the COVAX sort of vaccine alliance. A global economic recovery is going to be something that's hugely important for us. And then also there's other, I think, major international challenges, climate change, of course, and declining biodiversity. And also I put on that list of 3 or 4 top things, defending democracy as well. On both of those, climate change, we've got a fantastic track record. I think that helps us when we talk to others around the world about what they might need to do. And on defending democracy, we've got things that we can point to about how we've taken that seriously. Everything, for example, our reaction to Russia and also to China, look at what it's doing in Hong Kong and how we've called them out and taken action, and also the huge mass violations of the Uyghur Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really interesting. I want to come back to China and Russia in a sec, but just to probe you a bit on the economic recovery, particularly in the developing world. Yeah. We've heard from some NGO leaders have said that the UK should look at debt relief for developing countries, and their argument in a nutshell is, look, Ghana, for example, is currently spending 4 times more on servicing its external debt than it is on public healthcare, which would be a challenge anyway, but particularly as we recover from COVID. You have vast experience of working in emerging markets. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad you have asked me about that, Ryan, because I have been doing some thinking about this, and I think that the time has come for something like, I call it a global sort of green debt initiative. It would be providing financial relief for some of the highly, most indebted, poorest countries in the world. It would help us achieve our climate ambitions. But I also think it could help strengthen the Western alliance amongst developing countries. And all those 3 things are important, because look, there has been some debt relief and it's been welcome for these really poor countries. You mentioned Ghana as a country where its external debt interest is higher than its health budget. There's at least another 59 countries in the same place, some 60 odd countries in that position. There has been some debt relief. There's an initiative called the DSSI. We won't get into the acronym stuff, but the point is that has delivered some relief to the likes of Argentina, Lebanon, Zambia, Ecuador, these countries. But it's not enough. It's not enough for a variety of reasons. But let's just think about the pandemic. The pandemic's been tough on us, right? Goodness knows it's been tough on us. But just think how impactful it's been on a country that was already amongst the poorest in the world. The IMF recently estimated they think as a result of the economic impact of the pandemic, there's going to be another 100 million more people by the end of this year around the world in what they define as extreme poverty. So I think we can help these countries economically and also help on another massive agenda, which is combating climate change, by turning around to these countries and saying, as a G7, as the rich countries, saying, look, we are the big creditor countries. We will forgive you on chunks of your debt, but in exchange, we want a clear commitment from you to help fight climate change, because all of us are in this together when it comes to saving our planet, developed country, developing world alike. And if we want the developing world to do more, which is going to be essential, then this is one way to help them to recycle some of that money that could have gone on paying off debt to local low carbon initiatives, also to signing up to climate friendly policies, protecting rainforests, the oceans, and things like that. And I think if you set out some clear sort of criteria, transparent criteria, as a G7, as a COP, making this available, it can help achieve all of these things, help these countries and help the planet at the same time.
I want to come back to our relationships with other countries and how they may respond to this in a second. But before I do, we know that government can say this, but for many banks, if they continue to demand debt repayments, for example, I mean, we've helped, but perhaps there's still huge challenges that these countries face if they're dealing with this. Do you think there needs to be impetus from government to also say to banks, look, you need to pause on requesting repayments for the period of this pandemic? Do you think legislation might be needed, or is this something government should steer clear of?
I think governments and the private sector need to work together on this. It's always worth remembering a loan to a bank. Yeah, so when a bank when a bank makes a loan, let's say to a developing country, that's an asset for the bank. But the other side of that, on the bank's balance sheet, are deposits by ordinary citizens. So if you say to the banks, you've got to let the loan go, then what's the situation of their investors? So we mustn't sort of disassociate the two. That said, there have been initiatives in the past where the private sector, it's a process called the London Club, where the private sector has come together and said, you know what, if governments are going to give relief, we'll do our bit too, and we'll structure it in a way where we get some incentives, perhaps sometimes tax incentives and things. And so there are ways to work together on this, and it's been done before. And the other thing is that a lot of these countries, they borrow in the international bond markets, often called the Eurobond market. And in those bonds, there's certain terms and conditions. And I think that needs to be looked at. There needs to be a wholesale look at those rules, regulations, which in a way, if a country gets into significant trouble, as we've seen, for example, because of the pandemic, there are much easier ways for the country to deal with that problem. Maybe extend the length of the debt, maybe change the interest rate or something. In much more simple, more flexible mechanisms. So I think that needs to be looked at as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like this idea, and I'll tell you why. I find myself as a Brexiteer, for example, but someone who also is passionate about development. I find myself what sometimes feels like a sort of ever shrinking group, and it's that you can be passionate about tackling climate change and absolutely committed to the free market. Do you think we've lost sight of that over the last few years? Partly perhaps because of the toxicity around the referendum, partly because, as we discussed earlier, the sort of heated nature of the debates that we see on campuses and in other public forums. Do you sort of, see that as a challenge, being able to sort of have that big tent approach again that we saw perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, whereby you can be passionate about climate change, you can be passionate about free markets, you can see where private creditors and the private sector are coming from, while also recognizing that we can be a force for good and convene change in forums like the G7?
No, I'm very optimistic on this, because as we were going through Brexit, so after the referendum, the process of actually leaving, it obviously consumed a huge amount of bandwidth of government, right? And we saw that, and it wasn't helped, of course, when we Conservatives lost their majority as well. And that sort of seemed to me in the cabinet positions I had then, it just seemed to be all consuming, whatever department that you were in, and just your ability to sort of focus on these other big sort of challenges, issues. We just didn't have the bandwidth, the time to give them what they would have deserved. That's changed now, and obviously with Brexit out the way, that's hugely important. Of course, we've got a pandemic now to deal with. No one expected that, but look at the way we're dealing with the pandemic in terms of working with our partners across the world. The great work we've done in the vaccine, trying to help the developing world. Just look at the recent integrated review, where the government has come out and said that its number one foreign policy priority is combating climate change and declining biodiversity. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. But what that shows you is it's a Britain that is going to be forward-leaning, engaging, and confident in helping to do its bit to deal with the world's problems. But at the same time, we also understand that as you deal with climate change, we need to provide security and look at world threats. We need to encourage global prosperity, and that means trade for example, and play our role there. We can do a lot more on international trades and rules. We're an independent member of the WTO again. So yeah, I'm very optimistic about the role that the UK can play going forward. And I think if you look at how we've started with the G7 and the COP26, yeah, I think that's how it's working out.
Before I ask my next question, I'd encourage just again, anyone who's tuning in, please do keep your questions flowing in. Sajid, you mentioned working with partners. You're a one-time New Yorker, I believe, prior to going into politics. Yep. What's your take on President Biden? How's he getting on so far?
I'm really pleased that Joe Biden won the presidency, and at many levels. I mean, first of all, very simple level, I just think it's good to have a grown-up back in the White House, someone that you can engage with. We can, the rest of the world can, because what happens, who America elects is not just important, obviously, for Americans. It's important for the world. That's the way it is. It's the superpower of the world, and we all want to engage with it and help solve global problems. And I mentioned earlier what these global challenges are, what we are talking about in terms of the G7, the pandemic, global economic recovery, the defending democracy, climate change. These are all things that are completely aligned with the Biden presidency. And I think that because of that, they were aligned in a way that they never, ever were with President Trump. I just think we can achieve a lot more. Look at what's already happened. For example, we're cooperating on vaccines around the world with the US, and especially with some of the developing countries for the COVAX Alliance. US has rejoined the World Health Organization. It's rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change. Their envoy on climate change, Secretary Kerry, was here in the UK just recently working with Alex Sharma, and that's just great to see. Even on trade, how many people said that because of Trump, we'll be able to get a trade deal with the US? I desperately want to see a trade deal that works for both the UK and the US. And I think we will eventually get one, but we were never, ever going to get one under Trump. But we're much more likely to get one with Biden. He's pro-trade, he's a multilateralist, and also look at what he's already done. He's lifted the tariffs that President Trump imposed on our steel, on our whiskey, on our aluminium. He's lifted those tariffs. I'm not saying getting a trade deal is going to be easy and straightforward, not least because the Congress in the US is probably not as pro-trade as it's been in the past. But I think we've got a much better chance of the things that we want to see because of President Biden.
I want to come back to the US, but before I do, I have a question from Nick Dale. Nick asks, I haven't heard the F word yet, freedom. How important is economic freedom to you, and how receptive were the other cabinet members to arguments based on it?
No, Nick, I mentioned earlier the importance, I think I didn't say the importance of free enterprise and how important that is, and that is about economic freedom. And I think it remains essential. People say rightly that this pandemic has changed a lot, and it has. The world that we will be in post-pandemic won't be the same as it was pre-pandemic, and lots of things have changed, and some permanently. But the one thing I'd say to Nick that hasn't changed is how you generate wealth and opportunity for your citizens. That comes from a free market, a free enterprise economy, and that means that you've got to be a country that keeps regulation sensible, keeps taxes low, is pro-business, supports innovation and creativity. And by the way, I think we can do more of that, just that, because we're outside the EU now, because when it comes to regulation, for example, we've got much more freedom of maneuver. We can be more agile, more nimble. Our regulators can move more quickly, especially on technology, on life sciences, and these future growth industries. We can do a lot more.
Just jumping back to the US angle for a moment. I remember when you were in cabinet, Sajid, speaking out against some of the things President Trump said. Are there any individuals in the Republican Party that you look over the pond and see as people who could help bring that party back to the mainstream? Anyone in particular you think we should keep our eye on with a view to the next presidential election, which while in theory, of course, is a long time away, always starts up before you know it.
Look, I don't want to pick any individual. I think it's too early for that. But your point is that's implied through your question about getting the Republican Party back to the, whether you call it the mainstream or just a bit more common sense, is going to be important, not just for the United States, but for the globe. And let's see what happens. And I'd love to say here and say that that's already happening. We're starting to see that change. I just think it's too early to say that. But what you want to see in the US, from our point of view, it'd be great if the two big parties in the US were both more aligned with the UK and our interests. At the moment, I think we're certainly, for the reasons I've said, we're seeing that from the Biden administration. But I've got a lot of friends in the Republican Party. I used to be a member of the Republican Party myself when I lived in New York, and I was proud of that. And I think that there's plenty of sensible voices there, good, strong voices that I think will get a real chance to show leadership over the coming years.
I want to turn now to some of the sort of tangible outcomes of Global Britain. But before I do, or rather, it's related, a question from an anonymous member of the audience. Given the alignment in the integrated review about foreign policy and trade, what are your views about merging DIT into the FCDO?
Look, I haven't given that much thought. I think that since we've had a separate trade department, it's done a good job. And I think both Liam was working hard, and Liz and her team have done an exceptional job in last year, especially. And so immediately, I can't see a reason why you want to look at that. I think if it's working, if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. We've got a big challenge ahead. A lot of the deals that we signed recently has been fantastic. We've sort of continued deals that we had already through the EU, these sort of rollover deals. Everyone would accept that looking ahead, there's a lot more sort of heavy lifting now to do in terms of striking new deals, whether that's with the US or expanding on deals that we already have with Japan or Canada. That's going to require more heavy negotiation. I'm glad we've been flexing our independent trade muscles again, so it's got us fighting fit to have some more trade deals of our own.
So thinking now about, and the question was good actually to bring me onto this, the FCDO, the D stands for development, of course. I always find it in my job, I say to your colleagues in Parliament, who like me are on the sort of Brexity wing of politics, I always say, look, actually, don't be put off by the left hogging all the space on this. Development is part of the 3 Ds, if you like: defence, diplomacy, development. And the UK is really good at this, but we don't own it. We don't own it as much as we ought to. What are your views on aid, and what role should it have in UK foreign policy?
But I'm proud of our aid policy, especially since sort of 2010 onwards. That I think we were right to commit to sort of 0.7% of our national income as an overall sort of annual budget. I think that in terms of what we do in terms of aid, there's not just the moral responsibility of trying to help some of the worst off people in the world, and especially whether it's economically or natural disasters and things like that. But also there's a naked self-interest as well. We are stronger ourselves if there are fewer failing, fragile states across the world. I saw as Home Secretary, how you have a failing state, how it can become a hotbed for terrorism. I saw how you have a migration problem that becomes a problem for everyone, if you have a failing and fragile states. So a sensible aid policy will make the world safer. It will make everyone healthier. Look at this pandemic. If we needed an example of if some virus starts off in one place of the world, how it can hurt us all, we've got it. Sadly, we've suffered from that. In fact, I think I'm right in saying is that because the UK did so much work in trying to tackle Ebola in Africa, and part of that was helping vaccine development for Ebola, it was that technology and that investment that allowed us, the UK, to develop the Oxford vaccine so much more quicker. So look at how that's paid off for us, and that came from an aid program. And then also we're all better off, if these countries can stand on their own 2 feet, if they can become sustainable, start trading with us and others, then we all benefit from that. So that's why an aid policy, I think, is important. And before you ask me, because I know you're going to ask me this, because why wouldn't you? You're going to ask me about, is it right to cut it to 0.5% from 0.7? Let me just answer that. Look, I understand why the government had to do that. And I think what's important is, let's not beat ourselves up about this. We still got a lot to be proud of. At 0.5% even, we are still there in the top, the top 2 or 3 of the Premier League of the countries that are doing the most to help around the world. And as we just heard from the PM just last week, in the integrated review, that we remain committed to get back to 0.7 as soon as fiscal conditions allow. And I think we're in a comfortable place on this. We're in the right place on this. We've got a lot to be proud of and a lot to be getting on with.
Mm-hmm.
Did I pinch your question there?
You did, but let me ask you, when the fiscal situation allows, for you, would that mean before the next election?
I'm not going to get into that. And having being Chancellor and putting together budgets and things, I'm glad I'm not having to make those decisions now. But what is important is the government has made that commitment. And as I say, look, I absolutely understand why we've made the decision that we have. But there's just so much that we're still doing to help around the world, and I'm pleased at some point in terms of the scale, we'll get back to where we were.
You mentioned a minute ago this idea of values, if you like, and the opportunity that development offers for us to demonstrate those values around the world. And I was struck, I think in one of your speeches, you spoke about, it might have been your leadership speech, that for your parents, Britain was a choice, and for you, the Conservative Party was a choice. These were not things that were sort of lined up for you as natural things. These happened because you chose them. Do you think in our aid work and our foreign policy in general, we don't talk enough about our values and the sort of moral case for aid? Because we can, particularly as Conservatives, we can almost overdo the sort of economic benefits, the security benefits that you've mentioned, which are obviously tangible and real and important. But do you think we should make more of a thing about the fact that it's the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do?
I think that in the last decade or so, we have done, as Conservatives, I think we've done a good job, much better than in the past of that. And if your question is sort of looking ahead, could we do more to show how our aid makes a difference on the ground, and showing people how people's lives are transformed? I think there's always a scope to do that. I think it will be helped by making sure, as we do, and I think the ministers have tried really hard to do this, is that every penny that we spend is properly checked and is efficient, and nothing is wasted. I know that's much easier said than done. Sometimes this money is not completely in our control when it's given to an NGO or sometimes even to a foreign government. But we've got to sort of make sure that whether it's through corruption or otherwise, that we're not sort of, none of it is going to waste. And also, I think always remember that ultimately what is the best way to help people in poor countries, that help them to help themselves, is to make their economies, their society, make it more sustainable, help them to stand up on their own 2 feet, and then they become our sort of trading partners of the future as well. And I hope that actually because of Brexit, we can also do a bit more of that as well. So for example, today there is nothing stopping us, if we wanted to do a trade deal, a mini trade deal or something with some of the developing countries that we might have an aid policy with, because we don't need to negotiate that with the EU anymore. And having trade and supporting business, supporting those countries to appreciate the importance of rule of law, of strong institutions, of freedoms is a vital role that we can play. And I think we're doing a good job. We can always do more of it and do better, but we've got a lot to be proud of.
I want to turn now, if I may, to the integrated review. The review said, to put it in layman's terms or my terms, Russia is a hostile state and China is a competitor. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I think it's accurate, but there's a lot to that. So if we unpick that a tiny bit, is that the review said a lot of things, but you're right those are two important things it said. So let's pick on those. That Russia is an immediate threat, and it's going to be a threat for goodness knows how long, and we need to take that very seriously. We saw, sadly, what Russia is capable of on our own soil. It killed people, murdered people by the use of nerve gas, and even when we say that, even now, it's sort of hard to sort of comprehend. This is what Russia did on British soil. I remember as Home Secretary having to deal with the aftermath of that. Look how what it's done in terms of its invasion and occupation of Crimea, its attack on people that support freedom. So that's a threat, and it also has a huge nuclear arsenal as well, and it has a leadership that seems to be intent on undermining the West, and in lots of ways. So we're right to focus on that. We're right to work with our allies, whether it's through NATO or otherwise, in confronting Russia. I think China is a much different, very different animal, and much more complex and of a different scale. Why more complex? Because whilst Russia is a very strong sort of military intelligence power, economically, in terms of other global challenges, climate change and things, it's not that important. Certainly not compared to China. And China has huge economy, second largest in the world by even estimates of every economist, soon to be the largest in the world. It has trading relationships with pretty much every country in the world. I think some 50 odd countries around the world count it as its number one trading partner. It has investments across the world. It owns over $1 trillion of US government bonds and things. So it's a very different, more complex animal. And also with China, we know that there's no way we're going to solve some of the big global problems. Climate change and declining biodiversity, probably top of the list, but also things like arms control. We're not going to solve that without China at the table. It's just not going to happen. So we have to criticize and isolate China where necessary, but cooperate also when required with things like climate change. And as a threat, though, it's a real threat. It's a threat that grows stronger by the day as its economy grows and China invests more in technology, in military. And we've also seen a China in recent years that feels, I think, more confident to confront, and whether it's in its own claims around its own sovereignty claims that it has around its own neighborhood in the South China Sea, or more even acting against our allies, like how it's treated in a completely unacceptable way our ally Australia by using predatory tariffs and other practices. And I haven't even got on to what they just recently did yesterday, where they sanctioned the MPs, the members of our parliament and members of the House of Lords, for calling China out for its mass abuses of human rights, especially of Uyghur Muslims. And China, it just shows you how they would react. These people were rightly calling China out, defending human rights. Whereas when we sanctioned Chinese officials, it was for the complete opposite of people that were denying human rights.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I know, in my view, I'm sure the view of most would be that those sanctions are worn as a complete badge of honor.
Yeah, they should with pride.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So just thinking again then about the sort of changed nature of the threats that we face, the review asserted that there would be a planned increase in nuclear weapons, but there would be a cut over time in the size of the army. What's your readout of that? Do you think that's a realistic attempt to address the changed nature of the world, such as you just alluded to, or are some of the former generals who have voiced concern more on the money?
No, I think the review is realistic on that. I have thought long and hard about it, and you thought about my time doing government and some of the things that I learned. And for example, you mentioned the nuclear cap, the raising of the nuclear cap, and it's just worth keeping in mind that the sort of missile, the anti-nuclear sort of missile defenses systems of Russia, China, they're improving all the time. And we also need to be thinking about how do we sort of counter that to maintain a credible nuclear deterrent. And then also when it comes to the army and investment and military more broadly, so sort of beyond just the army, that it is right also that technology, modern technology is given the prominence it deserves, whether it's the use of artificial intelligence, of robots in some cases, perhaps the robots to find landmines and things, but also more drones and other types of unmanned aircraft. This is going to be absolutely necessary for modern warfare, and I think we're right to prioritize it and to invest in it. And sometimes it's worth remembering that these, whether it's robots and drones and things, by deploying them, if we've got the right capability, the best technology, we can actually save the lives of our own soldiers, whereby not having to deploy them because we had a real viable alternative.
I have a question from a member of the audience, Layla Busper. Layla asks, once you have retired, hopefully not for a while, what would you like to be remembered for in politics?
Well, Layla, well, first of all, I think Ryan, I don't consider myself retired. So hopefully that's not what she means, but what do I think about life after politics? Was that the question?
What would you like to be remembered for?
What would I like to be remembered for? Look, I hope that certainly the thing I'm most proud of is my time in working as a public servant. And as I say, I intend to continue doing that for some time, but I'd love to be able to look back and think that during that time, I was able to make a difference and to change lives. And we touched on many things today. We talked about social justice for people here at home. We've talked about helping people that are less fortunate than us abroad. We've talked about the big global challenges of whether it's security or climate change, declining biodiversity. And I'd just love to think that on those I've made some difference, however small, that I've done my very best to help.
As you say, still a long way to go. So thinking ahead to June 2024, the sun is shining. We've all been jabbed. I've had a haircut. Hopefully you're either doing what you're doing or back in government, and voters are about to go to the polls for the next general election. What do you think needs to happen between now and then for the Conservative Party to be confident of being returned for another term?
I'd say, first of all, Ryan, I think here and now, looking ahead to that date, I think we're in a good position as a party. And that said, we absolutely cannot be complacent about the challenge that lies ahead. And I don't think we are for a second, but I just think that we can't assume an outcome for that election just yet. I think that what needs to happen between now and then is that because of the pandemic, that's changed everything. No government. We certainly did go into 2019 election thinking that we'd be the country would be where we are today. No one would have known, of course. And what the country is going to want to see is that from this moment on, we are doing our very, very best to deal first and foremost with the impact of this pandemic. We know, of course, sadly, people have lost lives. Nothing can change that. But how do we deal now with, for example, all the non-COVID health problems that have inevitably built up as we rightly had to prioritize COVID? How do we make sure that COVID doesn't make some kind of comeback, new variants and things? Have we successfully managed that? We're off to a fantastic start, better than anyone in the world with the vaccines, but how do we maintain that? Economic recovery is going to be key. And I think, as I said earlier, I think that Rishi and the team have done a great job in sort of putting the economy into some kind of hibernation. And as we come out of that, I think we're going to see really strong growth in this year, and lots of reasons for that. The fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, the global growth scenario, the savings, so lots of reasons. But longer term, there's some challenges around interest rates and inflation. So we've got to manage that well. And that said, I feel confident, I think, with employment. I think employment will take off again, and we'll see job creation again, and people can, with the right reskilling, move into new jobs, probably, hopefully, quite quickly. So we've got to manage that. I think all those things are important. And then on top of all that is obviously to show people that when it comes to the global challenges, things that we just can't do alone, whether it's climate change, whether it's dealing with the pandemic or global, that we are also playing our part. And also, we touched on aid today. I think people that wanted to know that Britain's playing its part in every way across the globe. And I think we've got a fantastic set of ministers, all of them, my colleagues. I think we're fit for the challenge, but we just absolutely cannot be complacent in any way whatsoever as we go out and take these challenges head on.
And talking of complacency, how do you rate Sir Keir Starmer's performance so far? I was watching an event with William Hague a couple of weeks ago, and he was fairly disparaging. He said Starmer lacks the star power of Blair and the passion of Corbyn. And as William Hague highly articulate, there was more to it than that. But that was the gist of it. Do you think that's fair? Do you think the Conservative Party rather needs to wake up to the fact that this is a very different leadership to what's gone before?
I think that's fair, what William Hague said there. I think that Starmer is not Jeremy Corbyn, and that's clearly a plus for the country, but that wasn't very difficult, right? The hard work for him is to show how he is different from everything that came before him, not just the leader. And he hasn't done that. He hasn't been able to do that, and I don't know whether he will be able to achieve that. You mentioned Tony Blair there. One thing Tony Blair did, whether we like it or not, one thing he certainly did, is just a fact, is that he changed his party, and he partly did that, in a big way did that by defining himself against what came before him in his own party. And by doing that, he was able to convince the electorate that he had, the Labour Party was, as he coined it, New Labour. It had changed. Starmer hasn't done any of that. But look at their response to so many of the biggest challenges that we face. They could have come straight out of Jeremy Corbyn's book. And some people say, look, he's got a hard job, and Tony Blair had a hard job in doing that. And I think, when was the last time Labour won an election without a leader called Tony? Almost 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that the kind of change that he would have wanted to, that he would have had to make, and Labour just doesn't seem to be coming through. As I say, look, we can't assume it's not going to happen at all, but I think that's been his fundamental problem, is that he's failed to change his party.
And we're almost out of time, but it would be remiss of me not to ask this one as we approach the end. What does the future hold for you, Sajid? Do you would you go back in if you were asked, or are you enjoying taking this time to reflect on some of these challenges that we've discussed today?
Look, I'm in politics to help my country. If I was asked to help in a different way, and of course I would do that. And that's what I'm here if I want to make a difference, and that's what I would do. But whatever happens, I'm staying put in Parliament. I'm staying engaged in public service and helping in any way that I can.
I certainly hope that you are back in soon. Our hour is almost up. I'm going to turn back to Mark Wallace to give the final remarks. But before I do, Sajid, thank you so much for your time. I wish we had more this afternoon, but I really appreciate it. And I'll hand back now to
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Ryan and the Coalition for Global Prosperity for this event. And thank you to Sajid for being such a generous guest with his time and his insight. I mean, we gave you, Sajid, an hour to talk about how to solve the problems of the world, how to foresee what the future problems were going to be, and how to design the way in which global Britain, reusing this using this control we've just regained for our nation, could navigate all of those challenges. I think it would have been a high bar to set for anybody to give that Herculean task, but you've done a pretty good job in the available time of clearing it. And
thank you.
Thank you. And also to our audience, we've had loads more questions than we've even had time to put to you. And I know there's a huge amount of interest in both these topics, the work of the coalition, and in your take on all of them. So it just falls to me to say a big thanks to everyone, including my colleague Tony Dixon, our head of events, who's helped to make this whole programme of Fringe events this weekend possible. Conservative Home will be back very soon with yet more insightful political and policy discussion just like that, which we've heard over the last hour, and we'll see you all soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Ryan.